not really like we have to get absolute correctness. It's like how many dollars are you willing to spend, and how much more improvement can you get out of your software for that amount of money. And so he's looking at this very lightweight end of the spectrum where you want to say, sort of put in just a little bit of effort and get a lot of reward back. Maybe not a full proof of the correctness, but some helpful thing that will make it work better. So that's had a big influence on my own research. I remember when I was a first-year PhD student, I think it was in Popple, and I'd come from a place where a certain kind of formal method was sort of in the air, and just that was a fish, and I was breathing a particular brand of formal method. It sort of came with the assumptions that if you could write it down in a precise manner, then it must be right. Yeah, which is like complete, like I think I look back on that, I think of course that's new. But he showed me this, he opened up Alloy and he showed me this model of the Macintosh Finder and how you put in a couple of what seemed like standard definitions of how the trash can should work. And then he could show a counterexample to how this just didn't make any sense as a specification. And that was really a mind-blowing experience for me. And now it's sort of just a basic way I look at the world. The specifications, of course, to be inherently. So anyway, so thank you very much for coming, and thank you for all your influence on my work and just on software engineering generally. Well,
thank you so much. So thank you, Robbie, for inviting me. That was a brilliant justification of my career. If I ever need to justify my career, I'll have to remember that, because it's better than I've ever been able to do for myself. I'm a great admirer of Robbie and his work, so it's really very exciting to be here. I should warn you before I start that this is a slightly weird kind of project that I'm going to be telling you about today. It's the kind of thing you do when you have tenure and nobody can any longer fire you. And it's also the kind of thing you do that's largely unpublishable. I'm actually hoping eventually to make a book out of this, but I well recognize that this does not meet any of the normal norms or criteria of publishable research. You'll be glad to hear that my students are being shielded from this and are doing much more practical and useful things. But I'm finding this kind of philosophical journey not only a very entertaining and thought-provoking one, but for me, a very interesting one. So I hope it's something that I'll be able to convince you is interesting too. So the big question I've been interested in is really, what is software design all about? So let me start by showing you 3 little problems. Oops, if I can make my clicker work. Great. So here are 3 little problems. And I don't want you to solve these problems. I want you just to think about what kind of problems they are. So here's the first problem to do with email. So Gmail, how many of you use Gmail? Almost everybody. So I actually don't use Gmail. So it might you might realize that I'm not an expert, but this is my understanding of Gmail. That Gmail, a couple of years ago, introduced this notion of categories, which provides this nice organization of your inbox, automatically identifying stuff to do with social media and so on. Now, furthermore, you can customize this in various ways. You can change the way the tabs are organized and so on. However, when this came out, there were some quite negative reactions to this. It was described as super confusing. And when you looked at the various blog posts that made these claims, this was the kind of thing they said. It was really ugly, stupid, and unnecessary. It quickly became apparent that this new feature was a disaster. So I think these were all overreactions. But nevertheless, there was something that was fundamentally confusing about categories when they first came out. And in particular, people were very confused about the difference between categories and something that already existed, which went by the name of labels. As one of the bloggers explained, this new tabbed view introduces this new element in Gmail called categories. But unfortunately, there's this thing that already exists. You already have these things called labels. But these labels aren't quite like categories. And yet, although they seem to be 2 different things, they sort of should be the same thing. And this produces a huge amount of confusion. Furthermore, if you actually, as I was researching this and trying to understand Gmail myself better, I looked up the word label in Gmail's help, and it told you labels help you organize your messages into categories. So it seems that there's some little world of confusion here. Now, this isn't just like a semantic philosophical problem. There's actually stuff you can't do. And in particular, you cannot associate tabs with labels. So you might have labels that you're using for other purposes, and you can do the nice tab design with categories, but you can't do it with labels. And furthermore, these tabs only work inside your inbox. They can't be applied to other parts of Gmail. So this is a real problem. Okay, so that's problem number one. Problem number two is to do with cameras. Here's a very nifty little camera, the Fuji X100, which was a huge success, and it's a beautifully designed, sort of retro-looking camera. On the software side of things, it has the normal kinds of confusing menu structures. So let me just show you one little feature there. If you select the image quality, you can switch from RAW, for example, to Fine plus RAW, which means you'd like to record, in addition to the RAW data, a JPEG image. Now, when I look through the viewfinder, that's my lovely daughter, Rebecca, I can do this cool trick. I can convert it to give me to instead shoot with an aspect ratio of 1:1, for example, if I want to sort of play it taking Instagram photos with this camera. And I can preview it like that. Now, in order to preview it like that, I choose the image size menu, which is currently set to 3:2, and I change it to 1:1. Okay? So this all seems very nice. So I can find myself in this state in which I'm taking, for example, raw images with a fine JPEG in a 1:1 ratio. And now the question you might ask is, what would happen if I came and I decided I didn't want to store the JPEG image after all? Well, if I go and I change that from fine plus raw to just raw, this happens. This goes to raw, as I'd expect, but the image size, which was previously allowing me to set the special aspect ratio, now just says, rather unhelpfully, raw. As if to say, well, dummy, you know, you're in raw mode now. You can't choose your aspect ratio. So again, there's something confusing here, but there's something fundamental that I can't do. And what I can't do is I can't choose a non-standard aspect ratio and record in raw mode. Okay? Now, you might say, well, that's obvious. That's because this aspect ratio business has nothing to do with the raw data. It's used to post-process that data into a JPEG with the appropriate aspect ratio. And that would be perfectly good explanation. It would be a sad explanation if it were true. It turns out that the designer of the camera has done a much better job than that. And if you look, I'm not sure you can tell, this is actually a raw image opened in the raw editor. And you can see here it's marked with a crop line where the aspect ratio was actually set in the camera. So actually, the raw image is including metadata. And you can then undo that metadata. So this is not an explanation. This is purely a software glitch. Here's the third problem, to do with fonts and styles. If you open up the character style dialog in Adobe InDesign, which is a very popular desktop publishing program, you can, for example, define an emphasis style, where you might, for example, decide that everything that's going to be emphasized is going to have the font style italic. Okay? And you can imagine how that could be useful. It could be useful because I could, wherever I want something to be italicized in my document, irrespective of the size or the font or whatever, I could apply this emphasis style. But better than that, if later I decide I want to emphasize things by underlining them rather than italicizing them, I can just change it here in this style, and it will automatically be applied everywhere. So that's a very nice idea. Now, the question is, if I click on font style, what do you think I'm going to see there? What will my options be aside from italic? Bold, underline, exactly. That's what you might expect. What you will actually see is this. Right? And this is, again, there's a little bit of a conceptual confusion here, right? Which is I'm not really sure why I'm getting all these things or what they all mean, although I can sort of understand light italic is going to give me a light italic, a version of the font which is both italicized and lighter. Unfortunately, that's not quite right. Light italic won't take a font and make it lighter automatically. These are not transformations. Light italic is the italic setting for a font that is already a light font. Right? So the consequence of this is that you cannot actually define in InDesign a style that italicizes. And the reason you can't do that is that to italicize Arno regular, you would indeed turn it to Arno italic. But if you started with Futura book, the italic version of Futura book is called Futura book oblique, and the italic version of Magma Light is called Magma Light italic. Right? So what this actually means is that this feature doesn't really work. It's fundamentally flawed. So what kinds of problems are these? Are they minor nitpicks? I would say they're not. In all these cases, they actually prevent you from doing important things. Are they coding bugs? Well, I would say, again, they're not, right? Clearly, there's some kind of coherent specification here which is being met by the code. And none of these have been reported as bugs as far as I know. Are they user interface flaws? Well, of course, in some sense they are. But I would argue that at least on the surface, the user interface is to the normal professional levels of quality of the rest of these applications. The interfaces are clear, and they're certainly faithful to the underlying function. So my research goal in this project has been to try and understand what's going on in these kinds of examples by asking the question, what are the elements of software design? And one of the ways I think about this is in the contrast between designers and engineers. So if we think about physical buildings like this, designers worry about notions and ideas that are relevant to the user of the contrived designed thing, right? So a designer of a building might be interested in, what a facade looks like, what kind of flow there is, what kind of access there is, and what kind of light there is. Oh, I'm sorry. What I meant here on the top line was what the kinds of elements that they would be concerned with, and underneath what kinds of qualities of those elements, right? So an architect thinks about elements like facades and entry spaces and so on, and thinks about qualities like flow and things like that. A structural engineer, on the other hand, thinks about elements like beams and walls, and of course beams are of no interest to the occupants of the building. They're only interesting to the structural engineer insofar as they hold the building up. And the structural engineer is not so much interested in flow and access and light, but rather in the structural integrity of the building. So as designers and builders of software, we're very familiar with the engineering perspective, where the kinds of elements we deal with are things like functions and abstract data types and so on, and the kinds of criteria we use to judge them, such as whether or not we've achieved sufficient decoupling and whether our features are localized. But we don't have a lot to say about what should go in this box. How do we think about the design of software from the user's experience? So that's really what this project is about. It's trying to answer this question, to put something into this box. So I asked myself the question, what is the essence of a software application? What's it all about? Well, if you think about any application, if you had to explain it to a Martian, it's really about the underlying concepts. So, for example, Twitter is really nothing more. To understand Twitter and how to use it and what it really is, you need to know what a tweet is, what a hashtag is, and what it means to follow someone. And if you've mastered these concepts, then in some sense you've mastered Twitter, right? Twitter's pretty easy. If you want to master Photoshop, you're going to need to learn what a layer mask is, which is much more complicated. You can use these tools without really fully appreciating all the concepts. For example, you can use Microsoft Word without really knowing what a style sheet is. But if you want to exploit the application fully, you'll need to learn that. You might also not understand how fully significant some of these concepts are. The fact, for example, that Microsoft Word is about paragraphs is pretty significant, because you cannot have a hierarchical document in Microsoft Word, right? In XML or HTML or LaTeX, you can construct your document in a hierarchical way. You can have a chapter that contains sections, that contains paragraphs. You can't do that in Word. You have to fake it with numbering levels and things like that. And that's pretty significant. And these concepts not only define these applications, but they also define classes of applications. So the difference between a text editor and a word processor and a desktop publishing app, for example, are that they have different concepts. In particular, for example, that a desktop publishing app like Adobe InDesign or Quark Express has, for example, not only the notion of style and style sheet that you'd find in a word processor, but it also has the idea of a text flow, that you can have different boxes containing text that are implicitly linked to one another. And this allows you, obviously, to build things like magazine structures, where you have this column on page 1 is continued on page 3, and if I now cut and paste new text in, it will flow appropriately from page 1 to page 3. So these are fundamental concepts for desktop publishing. Here's a question that I thought was very interesting. Actually, when I was grumping myself about Apple Pages and what they did to it, I couldn't find text flows in the new Pages. And I found someone asking this question. They said, I've just upgraded to the new Pages, and I can't find a way to link text boxes anymore. And in fact, it turned out that what Apple had done was exactly to remove all those concepts that made Pages a desktop publishing app rather than a word processor. And of course, what they told the world was they'd added a whole load of new cool features. What they'd actually done was downgraded from here to here, no doubt to capture a much larger consumer market, and perhaps to cede the professional market to Adobe. But of course, that's not what they say, because I'm sure their marketing people didn't want them to say that. But conceptually, that's what happened. One thing that's important to understand is that these concepts, although they're very familiar to us, the notion of a paragraph goes back in orthography thousands of years, someone at some point had to invent them. So here's the guy who invented words concepts. This is Charles Simonyi. This is what happens to you if you invent good concepts. You get to take recreational missions on a Russian spacecraft. And what he did was he brought these notions, these concepts, to Word from Xerox PARC. And in fact, the way they got these concepts in Xerox PARC was by studying conventional printing. They actually went to a company that had been founded in the 19th century in Boston called Gin. And they asked them how they marked text up that they were going to print. And they taught Simonyi and his colleagues the concept of a style sheet, which they incorporated into Bravo, their text editor, at Xerox PARC. From there, Simonyi takes it to Microsoft with him that he founds with Bill Gates, and then from there to every other program on the face of the earth, basically. There are different kinds of concepts. There are concepts that are out there in the world that have been invented a long time ago, like the notion of a reservation, right? Which if you think about is a concept you need to understand, the idea that you could reserve a table at a restaurant. The Social Security number, invented in 1936. There are what I call instrumental concepts, which are invented just for the purpose of an application. Your application might deal with Social Security numbers, but only insofar as it processes them as domain-specific data. But the role of a hashtag in Twitter is much more significant than that. It's essential to the functioning of Twitter. And then there are what I call enabling concepts, and these are the things that without which an application could not work at all. So spreadsheets, for example, really rely on the notion of a relative reference to be able to copy formulas from one place to another, or the notion of layer masks in Photoshop or public keys in cryptography. And the important thing is that all of these are invented, even the ones we're familiar with. Okay, so now you might be wondering, what exactly is a concept? So I claim that concepts are machines. So let's take my favorite example of styles in Word. So what is a word style? So here's an example. We can select the normal style, and here's normal, and you can set the properties of normal. And once you've done this, everything that's set with normal style, every paragraph with that style, will now magically be updated with these settings. Now, I claim that what's really going on in this notion of style, in this concept of style, is that you have basically some data that is being maintained in state in your application. And that data includes, for example, the fact that the document contains paragraphs, maybe contains a style sheet. Each paragraph has a style. A style has some rules associated with it. A rule consists of a property and a value and so on. Maybe a style has a name, and maybe there's a complication of some based on hierarchy for styles as you get in Word and so on. The key point here is what makes this work is this, the fact that paragraphs are associated with these formatting rules indirectly through styles. You see, you have to go first from the paragraph to the style, then from the style to the rule. And that's what gives you the power of styles, because it means that if a paragraph has a given style, and you change the rules for that style, then all the paragraphs with that style will magically change. And as David Wheeler said, there's no problem in computer science that cannot be solved by introducing another level of indirection. So this is an example of an application of that very principle, that the problem of achieving consistent formatting is solved by adding this extra level of indirection by introducing styles. Now, in addition to this data, of course, you have operations that act on that data state, such as adding and deleting styles, modifying a style by changing its formatting properties, updating a style from a given paragraph, applying a style to a paragraph, and so on. So that all, I think, seems fairly obvious, but let me point out that thinking of a concept as a state machine in this fashion, consisting of this underlying state and these actions that operate on that state, has some consequences. In particular, first of all, concepts are closed things, meaning that they don't exist out in a vacuum, but they exist they don't need to be composed with other things to make sense, but rather they have behavior of their own. They consist of all the state and the relevant operations. And they're situated, meaning that, for example, a style not only has its own behaviors, but is situated in the context of the paragraphs for which the style is fulfilling a purpose. So what these properties mean are that concepts can be distinguished from some things that you might have confused them with. In particular, a concept is not just an entity, like, yeah.
If you go back to that slide, that looks a lot like, early justifications for objects in the design.
Exactly. Great. So I'll come to objects in 1 second, actually. So that's going to be my next example. Here's the object. Let's talk about this one first then. So imagine an object, the object that you might build in an object-oriented programming language for a style. Well, likely that object might contain, for example, a method to give you the name of the style. It might contain a set of rules which will be represented by some other data type, which can be accessed through this abstract relationship. And maybe it will encapsulate the notion of the style hierarchy, right? But it would be unlikely, if you were building an object to represent styles, that that object would include the notion of paragraph. Similarly, imagine in Gmail, right? You might have an object for a label, but the whole purpose for a label, the whole reason for a label's existence is to label a message. But it would be regarded as a very bad design of an object-oriented program for the object representing a label to be coupled to the object representing a message. You would absolutely want to decouple those from one another. And yet, from a conceptual point of view, the existence of this object makes sense only in the context of the paragraphs that are being assigned these styles. So that's the sense in which a concept is not an object or a data type. Yes? Because I'll compose different concepts to make my application. Is that what you mean?
I'm not sure, but I guess if style didn't interact with paragraph the right way, it wouldn't do what you wanted it to do.
No, that's right. And so what I'm saying is, rather than defining the style and the paragraph independently, if I want to actually characterize style as a concept, it's going to need to be in the context, situated in the context of the paragraph, because that's where it operates and provides its meaning and value.
So some concepts can be reflected as constructs in a particular values, maybe in a program they're running the program, and some others can't, I think is what you're saying.
Well, I'm not sure that any can be provided can be given meaning independently as values. They all provide meaning in context. That's what I'm really saying. Maybe we'll come back to that and you can question this issue. I have to say, this is stuff I'm sort of working out. I'm trying to come up with some crisp characterization of what a concept is. And I have to say, I certainly don't feel I've succeeded. So this is a sort of first draft. So if you're confused, then all I can say is I am too. This is a best effort attempt. But this, I think, is when people talk about concepts as in a concept hierarchy, in the normal philosophical sense, the concept of a dog, the concept of a cat, they're thinking of classifications of individuals. So that's the first thing I'd like to point out this isn't. It's not an entity. It's not this. And also, people often ask, well, isn't a concept just a feature? And I would say no, because a feature is really any increment of functionality. Perhaps your word processor didn't allow you to update styles from paragraphs, right? And that could be added as a feature. And I'd like to reserve the word feature for that. But concept has the entire collection of all this functionality that forms a coherent whole.
So somehow the definition of the concept is going to be, if you think in terms of these things, you're going to get a good design. And so we're trying to make that more precise.
Well, that would be a very strong claim. What I would like to say is that at least this gives you a granularity with which to think about design. It tells you what kinds of pieces you might consider. And I'll say later it might also tell you what pieces you should consider at a given time together, rather than building half of this at one point and half of this later in an agile development. An application I think of as a concept family. So you can define a notion of dependence that says a concept C depends on a concept C prime if for every application, if C is a concept of that application A, then C prime is also a concept of it. So what do I mean by that? Think of the world of word processors. I might say that for example, style depends on paragraph, because I could have a word processor that had paragraphs in it but had no styles. But I couldn't have a word processor that had styles but no paragraphs, because styles have to style something, so there has to be something there. So as in Parnas's notion of uses, this notion of dependence implicitly defines a family of products I could build. Yes, Ari? That's right. Absolutely, and you're quite right. And that's I don't know how to express that, but that's absolutely right. So there's a lot of work to be done on these dependence diagrams and whether they can be made sort of generic in that way. I've experimented with various ways of sort of turning this into a generic thing that could be fulfilled by a character subsequence in a paragraph and so on. But this is the simple picture for now.
I guess what I was trying to say is it seems to me that the properties that you want things in the box to have are the properties that will let the transformation apply it. I mean, what I like about this picture is I think it actually shows the sort of constraints of compositionality on these things. But when you look inside the boxes, they have to be able to be transformed in the appropriate way. I mean, that's actually, whatever you put in that box has to be transformed in the appropriate way by the style.
I think that's right. This is going to have some properties for the thing that uses it, as it were. I think
Functors and signatures.
maybe, yes. So, for example, this induces a family like this. You know, there are word processors that only have a notion of text, like Emacs. There are ones that have text and format, like the Stickies application in the Mac. There are ones that have format text and paragraphs, like TextEdit. There are ones that throw in styles, namely OpenOffice. And then there are ones that have style sheets as well, like Word. So we can think of this space of different applications in terms of which concepts they use. Now, concepts can also be regarded generically. So you can find styles in all kinds of places, the very same thing going on. PowerPoint, for example, has schemes, right? And when you choose a scheme, right, there are things like background color. And if you change the background color, every slide that uses background color will see that change. Well, that's just the same as having a normal paragraph style. Likewise, this thing in InDesign called swatches looks like just a color picker, but it has a magic feature. If you color an element, say with this red, and you then go back later and change this red, everything that was colored with it will change. So, of course, this is another instance of style. So what I would like to do is claim that, and this really goes back to Larry's observation, that the fundamental notion of style is only that you're styling some elements, where element is a generic notion. Okay? And so I think of the concept of style in its generic form as being basically a fundamental base of these relationships, and then various optional add-ons, such as, for example, the notion of a style hierarchy, or as you get in Word, the notion that a style can have a next style. And then maybe variants. So maybe an element has, the element doesn't connect directly to the style, but has a name for the style that's then resolved, as you find, for example, in CSS. And then you can, in a typical sort of design pattern way, you can elaborate one of these generic concepts by saying not only what it is and where it's used and what its variants are, what its purpose is. So in this case of style, it's to make it easy to maintain consistent format. And then there are a bunch of other concepts this is related to. And it has issues that you need to know about. If you use this in your design, people have experienced problems with this particular generic concept. And I've been basically flushing out this catalog, looking at a whole load of different concepts. I think I'm going to skip this one. But this one, this notion of making a selection, I was going to include this to show you how even the simplest kind of idea that we're very familiar with has some rather subtle consequences. So let me skip down to the end here and just say that I've basically been building this catalog of these generic concepts. Let me say a little bit about why we do design, and this is a preamble to saying more about how to think about concepts. So we design things because we have some purpose we want to fulfill. You have some contrivance you're trying to build, and I'm using that as an intentionally non-committal term. The purpose motivates some contrivance, and then you hope it fulfills it. And if you're unfortunate, you get some misfit. The contrivance doesn't actually fulfill the purpose. And this, by the way, is not a counterexample, and I can explain that offline for anyone who's interested. But this is not a traditional verification relationship of implication or anything like that. So here's an example. You might want to make a changeable wall. This is something I wanted to do of photo prints. And so that might motivate you to say, well, I'll put up some corkboard tiles. Or perhaps I'll use adhesive corners on my prints. Or maybe I'll use magnetic paint. And then the question is, which of these actually fulfills the purpose I have in mind? So perhaps I reject adhesive corners because they're not strong enough. And I reject the corkboard tiles because they damage the prints, because I have to put thumbtacks through all my photos. And so eventually maybe I choose the magnetic paint, and then that's actually what my wall looks like, and it worked very nicely. However, you might say, well, why couldn't I preempt these in advance and simply say that I want my changeable wall of prints to be both strong enough and to cause no damage to the prints, so that I would have known in advance that these would not be fit for purpose. In other words, is it not possible to have a complete description of your requirements? And it's not possible. And the reason is because there will be some misfits that you will never predict. These are the anticipated ones, but maybe you don't think that your magnetic paint is going to block Wi-Fi, because when you're thinking about a wall of photos, Wi-Fi is not your concern. So these misfits are unanticipated, and there's not much you can do about that. And this is really what Christopher Alexander's book, Notes on the Synthesis of Form, is all about, the impossibility of predicting whether a design will fulfill its requirements, and even expressing those requirements in any complete way. Now, if there's one thing you remember from this talk, it should be this. My belief is, my current belief, because this is research, that the best thing we can do to assess whether or not your concepts are good is to attempt to align each of those individual concepts with a purpose. So we have all these purposes, and I want to find, all these concepts, and I want to find purposes that can be associated with each concept. So for example, for the Microsoft Word example, I have concepts like paragraphs and style sheets, and I would like to find a separate justification for each of these concepts in the purpose space. So I might say, for example, that styles achieve consistency within documents. They make sure that every heading is bold 14 point. Style sheets, on the other hand, achieve consistency across documents. Everyone in the company is going to format a memo like this. This one, although I put it first, I'm not really sure what the purpose of paragraphs is. It's a kind of tricky one that we could debate. But they provide some kind of elemental structure for the style mechanisms. So I would like to explain a concept in terms of its purposes and find some coherent way to do that. Here's a simple example. This is actually an increasingly old-fashioned device which fewer and fewer people recognize. Actually, can I ask, how many of you know what this is and how to operate it? Okay, most people. So this is a timer. You plug your light in the side, for example. And here's how to think about how it works. I'm going to provide you with an archetypal scenario. I'm not going to give you a full general description. I'm going to give you one scenario. It's going to ignore a whole load of accidental aspects of the design. I'm going to get straight to the essence, and I'm going to tell you how the purpose is filled through this essential scenario by a combination of actions that the system and the user performs. So for example, I might say, whoops, if you pull a tab, one of these little tabs out, right here, then that's the user action. Then, when that time slot comes around, that's the system action, because this thing is going click, 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 right? When that time comes around, the light will go on. And I claim that this little scenario is the justifying explanatory principle for this design. Once you understand this, you know how to use this timer, okay? And this idea isn't mine, by the way. It's one I've adapted from the philosopher Michael Polanyi, who uses it to explain the difference between science and engineering. And he says this kind of operational principle is basically why a scientist could never explain to you how a clock works. Right? If the most brilliant physicist were given a clock but had never seen a clock before, he or she wouldn't be able to make any sense of it, right? Because the entire meaning and understanding of the clock is not the physical mechanism, but the fact that that physical mechanism fulfills a purpose, namely telling the time. And if you don't understand that, you can't understand the clock. So we can give these operational principles for all different kinds of concepts. So for example, for a style, the operational principle might be, if you change a style's format, then all paragraphs of that style will change format accordingly, right? So this is the crucial scenario that explains how this helps you obtain consistency in design. Similarly, in Facebook, if you tag a photo, all friends of the person tagged will be able to see the photo. In fact, Facebook is kind of an interesting counterexample, perhaps, because they probably don't want you to understand the full consequence of all the things you do. But this is, in fact, one of the things that will happen by default if you tag a photograph. And similarly, why would you select files in the Finder? Well, the reason is, if you select files, then when you perform one action on them, like pressing delete, you'll move all the files together to the trash. That's the operating principle of selection. It's that you can aggregate a single action over multiple objects. So putting this together, in order to explain a concept, we have three parts: the purpose, the operational principle, and then potentially misfits that explain why it doesn't work. So going back to the trash, which, as Robbie mentioned, I've been thinking about for a long time as a motivating example, probably at least 20 years. What's the purpose of the trash? It's to allow undo of deletions. What's the principle? It's that if you delete a file, it moves it to this special folder, and you can restore it from that folder. But once you empty the trash, it's gone for good, and you get your space back. So this is very nice. And I claim that if you understand this principle, you know how to use the trash, even though this doesn't, in fact, cover every possible scenario, like what happens if I empty the trash twice, what happens if I empty the trash before I do a deletion, and so on. But even this lovely design has some misfits. So for example, if you delete a file on an external drive, you cannot reclaim the space until you empty the trash, right? Because moving something into the trash doesn't give you the space back. The problem is you only have one trash. So if you empty the trash, you'll now lose the ability to restore any file on your system from any drive. So this is a pretty significant flaw. In fact, fixed in a recent version of OS X, but only in the last year or two. Here's another misfit. If you delete an old file and you change your mind, there's no way to get it back. And the reason is because you probably have a huge number of files in your trash. And if you don't remember the name of that file, there's no way to find it, because you cannot sort files in the trash by deletion date. Again, this in fact was fixed about a year or two ago, but it lasted at least 20 years in the design of the trash. So these are kind of interesting misfits. Let me see. I'm going to skip some stuff here. So when we think about design criteria for concepts, this is the fundamental principle. It's that I claim that in a well-designed system, each concept should be motivated by exactly one purpose. And that means not only should you have a purpose for the concept, you should know why it's there, but there should only be one. They should be mapped one-to-one like this, purposes to concepts. And conversely, none of these things should happen. So I'm going to give you some examples of these cases where you have a purpose that has no concept, a concept that has no purpose, a concept that has two purposes, and a purpose that has two concepts. And my claim is that all of these lead you into trouble. I think you'll probably believe that these are obviously bad on the left. So the more interesting case, I think the most interesting one is this one, the overloading case. So unfulfilled purposes. So normally an unfulfilled purpose sort of induces in your mind some concept that you wish that was there. So that's what happened in the InDesign example I showed you. There's a purpose, and the purpose is to get italicization everywhere, which is not being fulfilled. And the reason it's not being fulfilled is because there is a concept, namely the concept of a subfamily. That's what Microsoft actually calls it, which is necessary here and happens to be missing from this application. And there are many other examples of unfulfilled purposes you can find, and I could tell you about these afterwards, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip them. Unmotivated concepts are concepts that exist but have no purposes. These are harder to find because they cost a company money. So the question is, why would anybody ever build something that has no value? And so I have to say these are kind of hard to find. But for my theory, I need to be able to populate this space a little bit. I suspect they exist much more in tentative early stage designs before people have actually put them out there and found whether users like them. But the kind of thing that comes to mind is pokes in Facebook. I'm not sure what poking was for. But it didn't have a very happy fate. And I suspect that's partly because it was a concept that did not really have an articulated purpose. And there are other things. For example, maybe buffers in text editors are like this. Maybe the only reason buffers ever existed was because we weren't able to write back to the file system with appropriate performance. And I think this is why Apple actually got rid of buffers in all their applications recently. And just for the programming language people, some examples. Clearly, boxing in Java has no purpose, right? It's there simply to overcome a botch that they chose to treat primitives and objects completely differently. And having done that, they needed to introduce some mechanism to make up for that problem. Or nulls in JavaScript. When I teach JavaScript, I have to keep reminding myself what null is and what the difference is between null and undefined, and I can never remember. And the reason is null has no purpose. Redundant concepts. So redundant concepts are things like category in Gmail, right? We have both labels and categories, and they are both concepts that are there for the purpose of classifying messages. And we shouldn't need both of them. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. But there are other examples of those. Overloaded concepts are the really interesting ones, I think. And here's a quote I like very much from the New Testament. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. So I'm convinced that the same is true of concepts. A concept cannot have two masters. So in this case, a concept with two purposes is, I claim, doomed to failure. And I'm going to give you 3 ways in which this happens in practice. The first I call piggybacking, which means that you had some old concept there, and you hacked a new concept, a new purpose onto it, because it was just easier than making a new concept. The second I call false convergence, which means that two purposes seem to you the same thing. So you thought that you could treat them with the same concept, but actually you can't. And the third is what I call emergent purpose, which means that you started out with one purpose, but it sort of it morphed into another purpose, but you still only had one concept. So this example of the camera that I showed you, I claim is an example of piggybacking. Because if you look at this menu closely, what you can see is that this menu, which was appropriately called image size, is about sizing the JPEG image. Right? And you can see it has large, medium, and small. And it tells you, if you have set to large, this is the number of images that you will have left. So what's actually happening is that this menu is giving you pixel dimensions of the JPEG image. And of course, what they realize is, wouldn't it be lovely to give the user the possibility to choose the aspect ratio? And some clever engineer said, we don't need a new concept for that. We can put it in here. Right? But of course, the consequence of putting it into the JPEG functionality meant that now suddenly, when you turn off JPEGs, it no longer works, even though the underlying functionality does work on RAWs.
Someone said, oh, we've got 8 bits that we're storing large, medium, and small. We only needed 2 bits for that.
That's exactly right. Yes, it's the bit twiddlers who are particularly keen on piggybacking. Let me give you an even more shocking example of piggybacking, which still makes me astonished and frustrated. Yes? So I missed the question? Oh no, I don't. I mean, this is a reconstruction. All I'm pointing out is I think it's plausible that this is the kind of thing that went wrong, and it's the kind of error we're all familiar with and the kinds of mistakes we made. So I think it's likely that someone saw this opportunity for piggybacking, but I don't really know. And this is true, in fact, I would say for everything I'm showing you today. You should take it all as idle speculation. The Epson, is a great company, makes fantastic printers, but they do funny things when they build printer drivers. So here's what happens when I load the driver from my photo printer, the R2400. If I want to choose the paper size, and I open that up, I get these options. And you can see what they've done is they needed somewhere to allow you to choose the feed. right? But they didn't want to add to this, because it wasn't there in the standard dialog. They didn't want to add a special paper feed option that would allow them to distinguish feeding from the front or feeding from the sheep feeder or whatever. So they added it to the paper size. And needless to say, this...
Like they don't have control of the source for that dialog. It's from Apple. And this is, yeah.
Well, I'm sure there's some stuff they could do. Xerox, for example, has a special Xerox features submenu. So I'm sure something could have been done. But anyway, the net outcome of this is that very weird things happen. For example, you can't choose custom sizes for front loading. Another weird thing is that when you're in various photo applications and you want to set presets for the size of the paper, they also end up, not surprisingly, being bound to the paper source. So very frustrating. Here's an example of false convergence, two purposes looking the same. So this is the performance review form I get given from my administrative assistant every year. It asks for a performance summary, which basically says, tell us how much you think this person deserves to have their salary increased, and justify it. And then it has a section on goal setting. It says, be a nice, friendly supervisor and help this person be more fulfilled and effective. And yet, both of these things are accomplished by the same questions that follow. And I claim that it's not possible to satisfy these two goals simultaneously, right? Because one of them is an unfriendly evaluation, and one of them is a cooperative, friendly goal setting. And I believe the same thing happens in a lot of conferences with review forms. You cannot both ruthlessly choose papers for the conference and provide constructive feedback to the submitter. I think in Facebook, initially, the notion of a friend had two distinct purposes: filtering incoming posts and controlling access to your posts. And that eventually led in 2011 to a recognition that following should be a separate concept from subscription. Let me give you an example of an emergent purpose. This is where you have an existing concept. That concept has an obvious and clear purpose, but that purpose changes over time. So email messages have the notion of a subject field, and that subject field plays a role, right? And the initial purpose of that subject field was to summarize the content of the message. In this case, my son telling me that my favorite movie, Catch Me If You Can, had yet another real-life occurrence. However, look at this case. In this case, when you send a message to the CSAIL-related listserv, it puts the name of the listserv in the subject list, in the subject header. Why does it do that? Because there's now a new purpose to indicate the sender of the message in the subject field. And as Shuram pointed out to me delightfully, this leads to a very nasty consequence, which is that if you make the mistake of BCCing a list, right, and that list is on a listserv that uses this strategy, then your BCC cover will be blown, because the name of the list, namely the target that you were trying to hide, will be written into the subject field. And that actually happened to him, which was how he observed it. And another example of this that my student Insuk Kang pointed out to me, in Gmail, let's suppose you get a message from Expedia saying, your trip reservation. And I actually noticed on this very trip that Uber does this. Uber's receipts all say something like, today's Uber receipts, right? Well, unfortunately, Gmail uses subjects as a means of forming conversations. And more unfortunately, labels are attached to conversations. That means if I have a label for my Chicago trip and a label for my New York trip, then I cannot split my Uber receipts or my Expedia messages, because they will all be put into the same conversation by virtue of sharing the same subject. So these are examples of how this emergent purpose prevents the concept from fulfilling its obligations. Now, what I hope you're thinking at this point, which is what people have always said when I show them this, is, well, I sort of see the problems you're talking about, but this makes me feel very uncomfortable. And the reason it makes me feel very uncomfortable is that they say, isn't design all about doing more with less? Right? In particular, what if we built nail clippers like this? What if we separated out every feature of the nail clipper and every function of the nail clipper, and we gave it its own mechanical component, right? Then instead of being this beautiful, elegant thing with all these overlapping purposes being fulfilled by single concepts, we would have this horrible, catastrophic mess. And indeed, this is the argument made by Karl Ulrich in his PhD thesis, and thanks to Yishai Feldman for pointing this out to me. for exactly why what he calls function sharing is an essential property of design in all realms. So I'm worried by this because this seems to be a refutation of my theory. It seems to suggest that the very best concepts should fulfill multiple purposes. So my answer to this, tentatively, is that that's not the case. That the case in which this really works is that your concept has a coherent abstract purpose that then can be refined to multiple concrete purposes. So for example, Amazon has this nice notion of lists. And you can have a list, and you can use it both to remind yourself to buy items later. This is called a shopping list. Or to get friends to buy you items. That's called a wish list. Right? And Amazon actually talks about both shopping lists and wish lists, but they are both lists. And yet that list is something that we all perfectly well understand. And I think the reason this works is it has a coherent purpose of recording items you want, which then fulfills these two more refined purposes. Another example, Doodle. Doodle allows you both to poll people, to get a vote. What kind of chocolate do you like? And it allows you to schedule a meeting. But underneath, these are exactly the same mechanism. Namely, the idea that there's some collection of values that you're being polled on. And here's a much more subtle example, which I think is arguably the essence of Photoshop and really super cool. In Photoshop, you have this notion of a grayscale image, and you can brush pixels on this image. So if I don't like how dark this bit is here, I could brush white on this. Well, this is horrible, of course. I don't want to do that. I want to make this lighter. Well, I can do that in a very cool way. I can set a filter on here, and what's called an adjustment layer, that says make the image lighter. And then I can brush onto what's called the layer mask of that adjustment layer, my white just here, to say make just this bit lighter. So what's actually going on in Photoshop is that this layer actually has two parts, one part of which is a grayscale image. And that grayscale image can be manipulated using all the tools of grayscale images. And this is a very subtle and complicated trick, but it's a brilliant one that arguably is what makes Photoshop really work. Now, there are risks even of these shared concepts when it's done successfully. One of them, of course, is that these concrete purposes will have slightly different properties. So Doodle doesn't let you do the cool things that When to Meet lets you do because it can exploit the properties of times and dates, in particular the fact they don't overlap. You can't do that in Doodle because these two elements that you're choosing could actually overlap. Amazon's wish lists actually produced some nasty security incidents, right? Because people didn't fully understand the public versus private nature of their wish lists versus their shopping lists. And so, the gutter press then goes and publishes all the things people are trying to buy themselves on Amazon. Well, here's another example. Sometimes you build it, and the shared concept makes a lot of sense, but you can't quite pull it off implementation-wise. So in Google Forms, for example, I can have a survey for what kind of chocolate people like, and that very nicely in Google Forms it's backed with a spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet is a concept fulfilling two purposes, or rather fulfilling an abstract purpose, which in this case is also being used for the concrete purpose of summarizing the responses of a survey. But it doesn't quite work. In particular, if you modify this spreadsheet, it does not modify the summary of responses. These are somehow kept independently of one another. And this is actually a very serious problem. It means, for example, that if you have dummy survey entries that you did yourself, you can't exclude them from the summary. It also means that if you have a private question, like if you'd like to reveal your name and any personal comments, feel free to do so, you can't eliminate those from the summary either. So I'm coming to the end here. Some quick conclusions. The first is I'm thinking this might have some interesting applications to agile development. I think the Achilles heel of agile, which I think is generally a great idea, is that you basically hack a system scenario by scenario. And the risk is that you end up with something like CSS, where you just patch stuff on that worked in each particular case, but somehow the whole thing was totally incoherent and never made sense. So the question you might ask is, what is an appropriate granularity for agile development? What do I choose for my sprint? How do I scope a minimal viable product? How do I think about what's going to be inside it? And how do I justify the increments that I actually decide to execute? And possibly a contender for this is that concepts might be the right kind of granularity to think about doing a development. this dependence diagram might help you think about what comprises your minimal viable product, and it might be thinking about the purposes of each of these concepts that can be used to decide whether or not a particular increment to your functionality is worthwhile. So in response to the question I posed at the beginning, you won't be surprised to hear that I think the answer to this is that the elements that we need to think about are purposes and concepts, and the criteria, the various criteria I gave you for of fitness for purpose, including this idea of overloading. So in summary, my view is that we've had this view in the past that the development of software is divided sort of above the line into the soft stuff that real engineers don't do due to things like HCI, right? All that stuff, the designy stuff, right? That real engineers don't care about. And then underneath we have all the hard stuff, the code and the algorithms and so on. And I think we're coming to realize that this is really not a productive view. And I would claim instead that we should think that above the line is the conceptual design, coming up with the essence of what the system is really about. And this is an activity that requires the skills both of the HCI designer, the human and psychological skills, and of the engineer to be able to articulate what these concepts are and how they're related to each other. And then underneath the line, there's the question of how you take these concepts and you realize them in code. And that's a difficult architectural task to do with performance and optimization and things like that. But I believe it's a separable one. So that's it. That's all I have to say. Yes?
Suppose you had a command line for your Fuji camera. Would that solve the problem? In other words, is the problem the mismatch where you can't access the thing that you access? Is that just a result of the HCI and it's limited? Or do you think you just can't do it at all, even if you had some very rich way to express it?
That's an excellent question. I think what you're putting your finger on is that there's a coupling going on here. And that if you had a command line setting for aspect ratio, you would have eliminated that coupling. And I've asked myself, is this a fundamental problem of the underlying concept or the way it's represented in the user interface? And I think to some extent that question can't be answered because it's sort of trying to imagine what was in the designer's mind to know what the concept is if that concept isn't actually represented. But I believe that the fix that you have in mind would in fact solve this particular problem. Yes?
When we teach HCI to students, we often talk about the system model, the interface model, and the user model.
Right.
Distinguishing between how the system actually works, how it's presented to the user, and how the user actually thinks about it.
Yes.
How does that maybe map onto these concepts? And I wonder if these concepts can be useful even for designers to more clearly talk about what's being expressed in the system and as a representation that can be useful not only for programmers.
It's a great question, and I would say what it's saying essentially is that those three models, as Don Norman says, have to be aligned with one another. And furthermore, it's saying that I don't think that software engineers are in the business of designing systems and then working with an HCI designer to come up with an appropriate model. I see software development as the very design of these models. These concepts are the real thing. I mean, after all, they can be re-implemented in code another day, right? No one said that when IE3 was produced, which had a completely different code base from IE2, that it wasn't Internet Explorer. And it was Internet Explorer because it had all the same concepts. So I see the concepts as the focus of design. In terms of the particular way concept models are used, I'm not sure. Let me just see something here. If I can get my... Oh, here we go. I'm having a conceptual problem to get my mouse to come back. It's probably there. Where is it? Oh. Oh. I can't do it. I have an example using focused on Don Norman's fridge of conceptual models that shows the relationship between his idea of conceptual model and this idea that I could show you another time. Yes? I think that's a good point. Are you saying that the extent to which the concept fulfills a purpose might actually be impacted by very subtle details of its implementation? Yes, I'm absolutely sure that's true. I'll give you my favorite example of that. So I don't know if any of you guys saw this, but there was this really cool device, I'm trying to remember the name of the company, that allowed you to transcribe whiteboard drawings. And the way it worked was that it had a wireless device that you clamped to the whiteboard, and then the pen itself had a little wireless transmitter on it. And what happened was it triangulated the position of the pen. And there was a different pen for each color, and it was a pen holder that you put the pens into. And I actually bought several of these for my lab, and they were very expensive, and I was very excited about them. And they seemed to solve perfectly the problem of getting nice drawings off a board that was not tailored for nice drawings. However, the way it was designed, you had to have a special cap, because now the pen had to be put inside this special body that contained the wireless transmitter, and the cap didn't quite fit. And the result was that your pens always dried out. So we stopped using it, because it was not usable. And it failed to fulfill the purpose. And I thought, and that was exactly this kind of thing. It was, in a sense, a perfect design, but the implementation was crucially lacking in that one respect.
So in some sense, you can annotate at the conceptual design level the performance need to fulfill a certain concept.
You could do that, but I do think it's going to be fundamentally unpredictable. The way I prefer to think about it is you can eliminate a certain class of design mistakes at this level, and that at least is better than not eliminating any of them. And there will always be some that elude you, but at the very least you've dealt with the ones you can deal with. You know, there's the famous example in Henry Petrosky's book, or one of those books about the famous St. Louis Hyatt balcony that collapsed, which is another nice example of this, where the design was perfect and the design was structurally fine, but the way the joints were actually implemented by the contractor caused it to collapse. So I think, yeah, I think that's right. Right. So I think there's fundamentally no way that a designer can anticipate all those problems, but what I'm interested in is a designer at least handling the problems that should be within the designer's purview. Yes, Robbie. Sorry.
You mentioned Christopher Alexander, so he had another book called Pattern Language.
Yeah.
And I think one of his ideas is the things that are time-tested, where you have the cumulative experience of thousands of people using this particular architectural feature. It teaches you the correct way to, or the options on how that can be used correctly. And I mean, software is pretty new. Maybe we just don't know how to do this because we don't have enough cumulative experience with how to design things. So in other words, it's not a conceptual problem, it's an experience problem.
Well, I actually think that, I totally agree that that is indeed the case, but I think that concepts can help because they can provide a structure in which to embed this experience. And I think there will always be new ones. I think that, when people ask why is it that 15-year-olds are so much better at apps than their parents and grandparents, I don't think it's because they have a brain that's particularly more nimble technologically or whatever. I think it's because they've accumulated an understanding of a bunch of cultural concepts that are out there they're familiar with. And those concepts that they're familiar with in one app are the same in every other app they use. And so being able to use an app now is being familiar with what it means to upvote a comment, for example. Everybody now understands that. It's the same in Facebook and WhatsApp and the New York Times, right? It's the same concept. And so I do think we've actually coalesced on quite a large collection of concepts that seem to be working pretty well. But we're often not very good at remembering their liabilities. So sometimes we go on making the same design mistakes. But I think we have made a lot of progress there. Yes, Robbie.
You didn't seem to commit to it, but it seems like all the concepts, at least that I'm remembering from your talk now, that came up have a kind of computational nature to them. Like, there are rules that you use to describe the interactions between concepts in a way that you can do things like check to see if they make sense, or make sure that the thing above the line is somehow related to the thing below the line.
Yes. The concept, so I think that's an important point. The concept, the way I see it, is a behavioral thing. It's essentially a state machine, and you could ask about conformance of the implementation to the concept design. What I don't think is behavioral is the purpose itself. When I say I want to achieve consistent formatting, that's not something I can formalize as a behavior. But the concept itself is a behavior. Yes, Larry.
So when you want to handle
You mean below the line, essentially?
Well, I'm not sure I would put them. I'm not sure I would put them there, but what I'm trying to say is that kind of. I mean, but the reason why I think that might be interesting is that you have to ask the question like, why is it a good idea to try and combine these purposes? And so there's, I think, two reasons. One is they really go together, like they're related to some larger family of purposes. In which case, I think having them on that side makes complete sense. But the other one might be, it really is the case that the mechanisms have to dovetail nicely, and that's why it's going to make sense to combine them in this instance. You know, that there are sort of reasons on that side of the line why you're going to end up combining them, really because it does make optimization possible. So those strike me as somewhat different reasons for kind of sticking things together.
I'm not sure I got both of them. One of them, the way I understand it, which I think is what I'm hearing from you, is essentially that every additional concept is a cognitive burden on the user and on the developer because it has to be implemented. So if you can achieve your purposes with fewer concepts, you've gained an economy advantage. But you're talking about something slightly different from that?
I think the picture that you drew doesn't capture the elegance of the design, of the nomenclature design. It doesn't show the way in which it's such a delightful design because of the ways in which it combines the concepts appropriately in that kind of multiple way. And just by saying, I'm going to stick these purposes together, I don't think explains to you, either the engineer or to the user, why this is such a nice combination. It's a nice combination because the concepts dovetail particularly nicely.
Oh, I see. I think maybe what you're getting at is that there's perhaps a composition at two levels. There's the use of a concept for two different purposes, which makes you think, wow, that's really cute for the user to be able to do that, and that really simplifies things. And that's, I think, what's going on with the layer mask in Photoshop. That's what's going on with the Amazon shopping lists. Then there's a much more subtle kind of composition where you take two things that are really unrelated and you find some way to make a single implementation component that delivers both of them. And that, I think, is what's going on in the nail clipper. That's right. But I think the interesting, and that could perhaps, some people have noted to me that that could be done at the implementation level in a hidden way. Maybe you have multiple concepts, but a clever compiler figures out, you know, that they can share a lot of, or a clever implementer figures out you can share a lot of computation between the two, even though they're very different. But I would like to point out that if you do that and you use the same concept for really different purposes, then you end up with very awkward coupling. So in fact, that very nail clipper design would be criticized in this theory of mechanical design called axiomatic design, because it's a very, very fragile design. There is no part of it that can be changed without changing the other part. If you want to change, for example, the springiness of the nail clipper, right, you're going to have to now do something like change, you know, the length of that little bar. But when you change the length of that little bar, the size of the opening is going to change.
Yeah, let's talk about this offline.
Okay.
We need to eliminate the separate concepts and make proliferating concepts. Like, we have the two concepts will be there, and then there'll be this descendant concept that relates to those, that combines those. So they can still have the whole separate, they'd still be there, but there'd be explicit combinations of concepts, not of...
I think we can talk after, but I think I have an example of that for you. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for being such a great audience.